Hi, TEDxers 6,000 miles away. I'm glad I could be here, even if this is a really new medium for me. When I told my daughter about my struggles with this way of doing a presentation, she said, "Welcome to the YouTube age, Tom." Anyway, it certainly saves money and carbon emissions. Something tells me we'll be doing more of this kind of thing. Because this is so new to me, I may be more dependent on my notes than usual. I hope you will bear with me. First, I want to look at the idea that we have a global economic crisis unfolding and climate change is becoming increasingly obvious to people. I'm curious if you would raise your hands, how many of you think we are entering an era where we can expect more emerging crises of different types? Okay. I'm going to be exploring here some ways those crises and our efforts to deal with them could stimulate powerful positive transformation. Most approaches proposed to deal with emerging crises depend on technological innovation or market dynamics or government interventions. I want to propose a fourth approach, one which focuses on enhancing the ability of societies to self-organize in wisely responsive ways. I want to further suggest that democracy in its highest forms is actually a way for communities and societies to generate the collective intelligence and wisdom they need to organize their affairs, especially in the face of change and challenge and crisis. Democracy can and should involve much more than voting and representative governance. We need the wisdom of crowds and more than that. I'd like to clarify what I mean by collective intelligence because it's a controversial term. Actually, I mean much the same thing as individual intelligence, but applied to groups. Collective intelligence is simply the ability of whole communities and societies to learn from their collective experience and respond to their collective circumstances in ways that make sense, ways that work. So it's pretty straightforward. It's like when somebody's smart, they can respond well to what's going on and take appropriate initiatives. And when they aren't, they keep making mistakes over and over again. So it's the same thing for a society. That's collective intelligence. Now, collective wisdom, I mean collective intelligence that functions with a consciousness of the big picture, the deep picture, the long-term picture, the whatever insights or solutions or policies come out of a process that generates collective wisdom. Those solutions make deep sense and long-term sense. So wisdom is wisdom because it goes beyond the apparent immediate demands of narrow self-interest. So I'm suggesting that democracy is a way for a whole community or society to make collective sense together, to be collectively intelligent and wise. Now, I realize, painfully, especially in times like these, that the democracies we see don't always do that very well. But I'm suggesting very strongly that looking at democracy through this lens opens up a whole new realm of possibility and potent ways to improve democracies so that they do act more collectively intelligent and wise. I want to share an example of some initiatives that can and have been used to bring more collective intelligence to democracy. I'll start with a particularly powerful one that has great visuals. It's a journalistic initiative that I use as a show and tell because I have the magazine right here. And this is McLean's magazine, which is Canada's news weekly, and something they did in 1991. This is the cover of the magazine, and they hired their polling firm to pick a dozen people who represented the diversity of Canada. So these are people from all walks of life, all socioeconomic status, races, and political views, and those political views represented in proportionately the different views in Canada. And they covered this, they pulled these people together for a conversation, for a weekend of conversation, to create a vision for Canada. And they covered this with 40 pages of coverage. I mean, nothing gets 40 pages of coverage in a news weekly. And they covered the people individually. You know, all the people are here. So if you're a Canadian citizen, you can, read up on who these people were and what their ideas were. And you can find out who's like you and who is like those other people who you hate, disagree with. And you can, pick who you want to track through the blow-by-blow account, which they did. They have like about 10 pages, day by day, hour by hour, who said what, the conflicts that arose, the people who said, what are we going to have to do, put the tanks into Quebec to get you people straight, and it just goes on and on and on. This is also in my book. Chapter 12 of my book talks in detail about all this. And at the end, these folks who were fighting so much, there's these archetypal pictures of people who were opposed to each other, now hugging. It's just amazing, amazing coverage. And there were CBC cameras there all the time, and they did an hour-long documentary showing all this on the TV. And here is their agreement they came up with after much battling. Suddenly they had a breakthrough, and bingo, 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 they get an agreement, and they all sign it. It's like the U.S. Declaration of Independence. They have all the signatures at the bottom. And the magazine even covered the people who were brought up from Harvard. This is Roger Fisher, who's co-author of the book Getting TS, a very famous book on negotiation, who helped get this through. And they cover also background information. Here's the sources of the conflict. So they there was controversy then. Quebec wanted to secede, and the indigenous people are saying, what about us? And there's all of this upset, and they go, how can we pull people together and come up with something? So notice that they pulled together a temporary microcosm. It's like if we just take a spoonful out of this soup of the society and have that represent the larger society, sort of like a jury does, and give them the privilege of a facilitated conversation so they can actually get to hear each other, and make it publicly visible. The people are visible, the process is visible, the results are visible. It had a profound impact on the larger community. There were dialogues all over Canada for about 6 months afterwards. And my only problem with it was, my disappointment was that McLean saw it as a fancy focus group instead of an innovation, a democratic innovation. What would happen if a magazine like this did something like this every year? Or if it was established formally in the government that every year, like a randomly selected group of people were picked, and they were helped to listen to each other and talk about how's it going in our country, what do we want, what feels like a good idea, what do we want to support, and then they issue that. No particular power to it, just issue it to the people and have the people talk about it. What if that was done over and over and over again, as regularly as we do elections? The whole reports to the whole and says, this is what we're thinking, and everybody watches that and talks about it. It would be a profound different voice in our political system. And there are ways that exist around the world for doing this with specific issues. And when you do it with a specific issue, you add in balanced briefing sheets and experts that the people involved can talk to. One really interesting example was several years ago in British Columbia. They had what they called a Citizens' Assembly on Electoral Reform. And these people, it's 160 people chosen at random from across British Columbia, a man and a woman from each legislative district. And they studied electoral systems and deliberated and went around the province, had public hearings, asked for white papers from people, and then talked amongst themselves. What do we think of all these possibilities? What should British Columbia have? And what they came up with was made into a referendum that went to the voters. It didn't pass that time. It required 60%. It didn't pass that time, but they're going to have another election in May this year, and it has a much better chance now. But the idea of the whole, this microcosm of the whole, coming up with something that then the whole can look at and decide on. Citizen juries is probably the most used version. It's much smaller. It's like a dozen or 2 dozen people. And they, again, interview experts and talk amongst each other about the issue. They become lay experts themselves in the issue and make recommendations. Hundreds of these have been held around the world, including a couple of hundred in the UK. In Denmark, Parliament convenes ordinary citizens whenever there is a controversial high-tech subject, like global warming or nanotechnology. They want to know what the people think about this. So rather than just surveying people off the top of their heads, they convene what they call a consensus conference and educate these ordinary people about what the issues are, and those ordinary people help pick experts that they want to talk to. A public forum is held, and the citizen panelists are there in the position of power on the stage, while the experts come and testify to them, and they can cross-examine them. You said that, and he said that. What's going on here? And then they go off and are facilitated in search of a consensus. What can they actually agree on? And then they present that to the public and the media in a public press conference and pass it on to Parliament. So that's an official kind of body that is being done in one country. And people are looking for other ways to plug it into the system. There's people who have done citizen juries on candidates for public office. So the candidates have to come and talk for hours with these ordinary citizens in person, and the citizens get a sense of who are these people and what do they feel about them, and they can write that up and tell the populace, the electorate, what they think of that. Similarly, referenda or citizen ballot initiatives, as we have here. In Oregon, where I live, there's a group that's trying to get officially set up so that a citizen jury reviews the ballot initiative before it goes on the ballot, talks to the people who are for it, talks to the people who are against it, and gives some opinion about it, which is put in a voter information pamphlet to let the voters know what came. And this is different because it's a voice of the whole. It is very much the same theory as the jury. The jury is a bunch of people who are picked at random from the community to do work for the community, deciding whether somebody's guilty or innocent. And in this case, they're deciding on policy, what would be advisable policy. And our public discourse in democracies is built out of partisan battle. And this is a different approach. And I'm not just saying we should get rid of all the partisan battle, but there is no voice of the whole present currently in our political discourse, and this injects that in. And you can make it more as powerful as you want or as not as powerful as you want. And there's many ways to do this kind of thing. I would love to see the internet involved more in this. I would like to see the public being able to be involved before, during, and after such a gathering through the internet. And there's been an experiment recently in Australia doing that. I would love to see the people who are deliberating on nanotechnology to be able to go online during the deliberation, and search for who's saying what about this, not just depend on the experts they have in the briefing sheets they've been given. But notice that all of these innovations are designed to engage and increase the collective intelligence and wisdom potential for the society. So that gives, and there's lots more about this. Cointelligence.org is my website. There's a lot about that, a lot about this on those on the website and on my in my book. And now I want to talk about another initiative radically different from this, but it also is engaging the collective intelligence and wisdom of the whole, and that's the Transition Towns movement. That began in the UK, in Totnes and Devon. In 3 years, they've gotten over 100 towns involved in becoming more resilient and self-reliant in the face of peak oil. Peak oil is not when we run out of oil. It's when oil is so expensive to get out of the ground and getting harder and harder to get, and more people want it because of population explosion and raising a larger middle class, that it starts to get very expensive and hard to get, and that has implications. And global warming, economic recession, all sorts of other shocks, natural disasters. So how do you make a community more resilient and self-reliant? And so there's about 100 communities engaged in this program, and 600 or 700 more on the launching pad. And this is in 3 years, so they've got something going. They have grown very fast, and in looking at where this came from, they've made it fun. They actually involve people where their individual passion is. They've made a positive journey out of it, a big, interesting experiment together. There's lots of gardening and support groups and singing and local currency experiments, having local money, kids painting pictures of what they want their town to look like a decade or two in the future. The transition town people propose that this whole effort to become more sustainable can give everyone a better life than they have now, not a more limited life. They use simple, powerful group processes that I talk about in my book, like open space, where everyone who comes to the gathering can find others who share their particular interests. There's no predetermined sessions, no speakers like me predetermined. And the World Cafe, which is like a regular cafe, except people are switching around to different tables, and they're all talking about the same powerful questions that have heart and meaning to them. And notice, there's no voting going on here. These folks are just getting on with it, helped by the organizers to do what they really want to do in meaningful collaboration with others. So this is a different kind of democracy. If you want to find more about transition towns, probably the best thing to do is go to Wikipedia and look up transition towns. They have a lot of links. I just got a signal of a card, which I don't know what it says. Okay. So there's one other thing I want to add to this, which is there's a conscious evolution dimension. I've gotten into the evolutionary perspective lately. And as a civilization, we face challenges to our usual ways of doing things. Social, economic, political systems, all our systems are being challenged. Cultural stories are being challenged. Our technologies are being challenged. In 100 years, there's no way we're going to look anything like we are today. And so what are we going to look like? There's some possibilities that are really thrilling, like creating a truly sustainable and just and wise and enjoyable civilization for the first time on Earth for everybody. And then there's other possibilities that are terrifying. We could push climate change so far that we wipe out most of the life on Earth. And we're subject to all the laws and creative potentials of evolution, and we will survive and flourish to the extent we find new ways. Consciousness, which the future will determine our survival and what we turn into. So I want to invite you to look at the dimension in which we are in this challenge and meeting this challenge. We are evolution becoming conscious of itself and waking up. And there's tremendous opportunities in that. On the ground and big, broad philosophical vision. I guess my time's up.
Gentlemen, Tom Atlee. We have time for maybe 3 or 4 questions, so just throw your hands up in the air. Yep.
Thank you, Tom. That was very interesting. I would like to challenge something that you said, though. You did say that currently you don't see a voice of the whole present in policy within government. There's actually a couple of things happening in the UK that show this is happening. Some policies being released onto the internet that's available for the entire public to comment on, especially around the release of government data for the public to use for themselves. And there was... on a local level in Birmingham City, the council had a plan for regenerating the whole of the city over the next 10 years, I think it was. And that was turned into a bloggable format, and the entire city was invited to comment on the policy online. Those comments were then taken and passed back to the council and are now being rolled into the policy ongoing. Do you see this becoming more of the norm?
It's funny, I had a hard time hearing it. I want to get a number of questions at once. What I heard was that there was online participation being invited by government on policy, and you're asking if this and more of this is a good idea, something like that?
That's right, Tom.
Okay, thanks. So can we get some questions? I'd like to have a number of questions together that I can speak to.
Anyone else got a question for Tom? Yep.
Hey Tom, great speech. I have a question. I have a question. Do you imagine or do you see that there's like a more direct form of democracy coming? Like not just in a regional area, but also national or global in a way?
I didn't get that.
Oh. Do you see or do you imagine, vision that there is a form of more direct democracy coming? Like currently we have indirect democracy, we vote for people and they make the laws. Do you think that in the future we might have more direct democracy, that like the people propose and make the laws themselves?
Okay, so the question is, do I see more direct democracy coming?
That's it. Any more? Shout out if I'm missing you, very obviously. Oh, thanks.
In the example you gave about Canada, one of the key aspects was the facilitation. And we have a lot of forums on the web where people are discussing things, even in magazines and so on, but there is no facilitation. And often when one reads it, it's just people repeating their positions. Do you see any opportunities for having more facilitation, perhaps even automated facilitation or volunteer facilitation to improve these dialogues?
Okay.
Is that enough, or do you want one more?
No, I can do that.
Okay, thanks everyone.
If there's any other hot ones, I'll hear them, but otherwise I can handle that. Yeah, first of all, I want to look at the direct democracy question. Direct democracy is usually defined as the people having a vote on everything, that they are able to vote on every topic. Voting is the appropriate mode where you can't get agreement. There's a woman named James Mansbridge at Harvard that wrote a book, Beyond Adversary Democracy, that said there are some issues on which agreement can be found. We can get a broad consensus about what to do, and there's some issues that we can't. And the issues that we can, we should try to do that, and the issues that we can't, we should leave to majoritarian rule and voting to decide. And what I have noticed and what I promote in my book and on my website is, which overlaps with the other things people have asked, dialogue and deliberation are not one thing. There's not one way to deliberate. There are radically different ways to deliberate and radically different ways to dialogue. And some of them are much more powerful than others. There's a thing called dynamic facilitation, which is the most powerful small group process I've ever run across, and I highly recommend you learn stuff about it. And I write about it both in my book and on my website. So having high-quality process, which usually requires facilitation of somebody trained facilitators, having high-quality dialogue and deliberation increases the chance that you will get collective intelligence and wisdom coming out of the conversation. If everybody is voting on everything off the top of their heads, you have public opinion ruling. Public opinion is notoriously not collectively intelligent and wise. But it's not a matter of having experts run. Okay. Public opinion is not a good source of wisdom or collective intelligence. And to the extent we empower people to vote separately without them talking together, from positions, from opinions that are really easy to manipulate. It's really easy to manipulate the opinions of the public. And to have everybody voting on everything from their opinions rather than from thoughtful, deliberative things where they have to wrestle with the complexity of the issue, where they have to talk to each other. This is a different kind of process. And I'm saying where we are now in the face of the crises that we have, we urgently need collective intelligence and wisdom to deal with that. And the kinds of process that I described are ways that we can have that. We can have the whole represented, a randomly selected group of people or people who have been scientifically selected because of their differences. If they engage together well, and come up with something really useful for all of us, that's a different voice in the system. And a lot of people, including Obama, are pushing the idea of having places where people can put their individual input. Blogs or, online suggestion boxes. This is different from the generation of collective wisdom on behalf of an interaction. You have interaction between diverse people. That can if it's done well, that can generate something that is bigger than whatever they walked in with. And in the process of dealing with those differences, compromise is not desirable. Sometimes it's necessary. But particularly with something like dynamic facilitation, you end up with people creating together something that none of them walked in the room with, that they are all excited about. There's an aha experience. They've wrestled with it back and forth, and suddenly it's, oh, that's what makes sense. And they all have that realization together. That's a profound phenomenon that most people have never even seen. They don't even know it's possible. When somebody argues with somebody else and says, you're full of it, what the facilitator does is go up to them and says, what's your concern? The disagreement is translated into a concern. And then the facilitator listens well and says, am I getting this right? And is writing down on a chart pad, am I getting this right? Is this what you're saying? It's really horrible that this is happening, right? And when the person feels well heard, the facilitator then says, well, what would you do about it if you were in charge?